you can't imagine how happy I am each time there's an Indian literature event in Paris. And this is no small event. I mean, you know, you have the festival and festival. You have the Festival of Indian Literature in the Mairie du 20e, which, you know, I partook into quite a few times, which is very nice. And then you have this one. You have this one, and I really would like to thank Via Caro, who's sitting at the end of the room, Columbia University, where actually I studied, Reed Hall, where I taught, and the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, where I did quite a few of my research when I was young. When I was younger, I like to add this. And I'm happy because, you know, each time it gives me the feeling that the French will be able to have a bigger glimpse into the incredible tradition of storytelling that comes from India, which I tried to do for almost 10 years by publishing many Indian authors. That Maggie Doyle from Robert Laffont, who's Vikram's French publisher, also does. But I mean, it's very, very important that this be reminded to the French and to the French readers, is that we are talking about an extremely powerful tradition of storytelling that goes back 5,000 years for the Mahabharata, that goes back, you know, the equal number of years for the Ramayana, and the different Puranas and the Vedas, and just an incredible, how would you say, narrative material that comes from India, and that only a fraction hits the West, you know. So each time there is a festival like this, I rejoice because I think that you're going to be able, and the French especially, are going to be able to, or the Westerners, I would say, are going to be able to have a glimpse of this incredible literary power. And among these Indian voices, the one of the formidable writer Vikram Chandra. Vikram has authored, for now, 2 novels, Red Earth and Pouring Rain, which came out in 1995, if I'm correct, and the majestic, the most incredible Sacred Games, which came out in 2006. And I say it's incredible because it's this long Indian saga, and forgive me, but I love long Indian sagas, that is, I would say, half 19th century social saga and thriller, and a thriller that makes you dive into the underworld of Bombay and into the world of the bais, of the mafia of Bombay. It's just, and the killers, you know, and the thugs, and all that. It's the, with I would say, Maximum City by Suketu Mehta, it's the book about Bombay that you cannot possibly afford not to read. The French edition is also published by Robert Laffont, and it was actually, I think, a big success in France. I was sorry to hear that it was maybe a little less big success in the States, and I wanted to ask you, as a matter of fact, Vikram, why do you think this happened? Do you think it has to do with the traditional isolationism of the States? Do you think it has to do with the image of India in the States?
Am I on? Yes, I'm on. Well, you know, it's very hard for writers to sort of make judgments about what works. I mean, I was surprised anybody wanted to read the damn thing in the first place, right? Because you always write in this little room alone, and then the book leaves you, it goes out into the world, and then it does things. Whenever we talk about this kind of thing, I always remember William Goldman, who's the famous American screenwriter who wrote, among other things, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. He tells us in one of his books that above his writing desk, he has, in very large letters, "Nobody knows anything." And his intent is to remind himself that about the movie business, that you can do all the sort of careful planning, and then it's like a sort of, the finger of the goddess reaches down and either points at you or sort of points at somebody else, and you can't really tell. So, for my purposes, the book reached wherever it needed to go, and it's still finding readers. A couple of days back, I got an email from an Oakland police officer.
Oh, yeah?
Who's apparently become my greatest pusher on the Oakland police force. He's making all his buddies read the book, and it's incredible to think that a book about Bombay cops is being read in Oakland, as a kind of counterpart, and that these guys find it persuasive, about their world.
Vikram also authored a collection of short stories, and he authored his latest opus, which came out, in fact, last year, and which is brilliant, absolutely brilliant narrative nonfiction, where narrative nonfiction is a nonfiction book written like a fiction book, if I may say, with the author who slowly becomes, in fact, a character, not to say the hero of the book, and it's this narrative nonfiction book that we're going to talk about. It's actually it bears different titles, and Vikram will tell us why. The title the edition I have is the Indian edition that was offered to me by your publisher, and which is called Mirrored Mind: My Life in Letters and Code. And the American edition is called Geek Sublime. And Maggie, in fact, chose to keep Geek Sublime for the French edition, which I think is absolutely great. So the French edition is out since today. And both books are on sale here. What blew my mind, in fact, in this Mirrored Mind, my life in letters and code, is the way that it takes us into Vikram's life, into India's literature, into India's culture, as far as Abhinavagupta's 10th century Hindustan, and it opens your mind to the knowledge that comes out of India, and at the same time, there's something so intimate about this book. There's something so personal about this book, and I would like to say that it's common knowledge in our French, literary circles, where it is believed that writers come out of their mother's womb with a pen in their hand by some kind of supernatural operation, that computers and literature never really go well together, let alone the fact that in one sane man can cohabitate a computer programmer and such a high-end literary writer. This is an enigma to many. But this is a quite nearsighted perspective, and forgetting something that is quite fundamental, is that Vikram comes from India. India today is the first software power in the world. This means that in 1985, India declared its IT revolutionary policy under late Rajiv Gandhi's leadership. Rajiv, who undoubtedly saw the computer as the tool to modernize the country. And finally, after years of modernization of the tool in question, well, the software revolution has reached a peak today in India. And when Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao visited India a couple of years back, he actually chose to go to Bangalore and not to Delhi. So this is to tell you, what kind of background we have here, and what kind of background is actually Vikram Chandra's. But is it enough to explain why, because Vikram Chandra comes from such a cyber India, where the IT engineers are the best of the world, why he's the immense writer and the sophisticated computer programmer that he is? I often say that India, with her 1,300,000,000 Indians, with her 23 official languages, with her 12 religions, with her more than 3,000 castes, with her 375 million new middle classes, but also with her almost 500 million people who live with only $2 a day, is the most complex country in the world. And also, I mean, how more complex can a country be where God is a sound, Om, where the Sanskrit word kal means yesterday and tomorrow, and where children from the earliest age study the most complex Vedas, not to mention the Hermetism of the 108 Upanishads, which are supposedly written to explain the Vedas. So I guess that, Vikram, my first question could be something like this. Do you believe that because India is so culturally, politically, humanly complex, that the Indian mind, used to so much philosophical, mathematical, mystical complexity, is much more at ease with the complexity of a computer than other people in the world?
That's a huge question. A little above my pay grade, I think. I'm wary of assigning kind of general qualities to 1,300,000,000 people. I guess for me, the one thing that I will say is that there's an immense obsession, I would say, with language right from the earliest historical traces that we have. So you were talking about the Vedas, and so they're revelation texts, wisdom texts received by seers. And very early, it becomes hugely important to preserve them, and preserve not just the sound, not just the language, the words, and the syntax, but to preserve every sound, every intonation, every small thing about them. So very early on, and we're talking about between 2000 and 1500 BCE, there is the development of what is called the Vedanga, the limbs of the Veda. And these are sophisticated people thinking about etymology, they're thinking about meter, they're thinking about sound, they're talking about grammar. Because when you recite the Vedas, you are actually reciting, as it were, the code of the universe, right? These are unauthored texts. They have no author. They have no intention. It's sort of as if the universe has this background hum, and certain people can hear it, and they give it to us in the form of the Veda, and so therefore it is our job to preserve it. So Fritz Stahl, a very eminent scholar, Sanskritic scholar, famously said that if the Greeks' view of the universe is the universe as mathematics, the Indian view of the universe is the universe as language, right? So because when you recite the Vedas, you're actually running the universe. In the sacrifice, you're actually making the universe present. The primordial sacrifice becomes present. So out of that tradition then comes this incredible text, which I think everybody who is Indian here will have heard vaguely of it, Panini's Ashtadhyayi. And this happens in about 500 BCE. So it's a grammar for the Sanskrit language, but it's not a paradigmatic grammar in the way that you and I encounter. Certainly I learned English in second grade from this terrible grammar book where, you know, they were you had to learn the verb declensions, going, gone, and you just had to like learn them by heart, and it was very annoying. So it's not that kind of thing at all. The Ashtadhyayi is a very short text. It's about, you can print the whole thing out in normal size font in about 40 pages. It is 3,976 rules. And by rules, I mean something that is very similar to the algorithmic rule sets that are used in computers today. So along with this, there is a list, for instance, of verb roots, right? So kr is a verb root. And when you want to make a word out of it, you kind of drop it into the Ashtadhyayi, which sets off certain rules, which set off other rules. There is recursion. And as it passes through each rule, the sound changes each time, until at the other end you come out with something like karma, right, from kr, right? And so it really is a wonderfully compact algorithm for producing language. And it has incredible effect on the Sanskrit language itself in that it formalizes it so that Sanskrit, unlike other languages, doesn't drift over the centuries, right? So if you have suffered through reading Beowulf, right, you know how different the English they spoke in medieval England was from now. But Sanskrit, because it is so tightly defined by a formal system, collapses the distinction between formal language and natural language. And so if you have a Pandit in Varanasi today write a grammatically correct Sanskrit letter and you time machined it back 2,000 years, they would be able to read it and make some kind of sense out of it. So that's the one effect within India. The other career that the Ashtadhyayi has is very interesting, which is outside in Europe. So in the 18th century, in the first flowering of Orientalist research, it gets discovered. And then through the Germans, and the Germans, as you know, were big in Indological research, especially then, it gets translated. And then it slowly gets understood by people who are working on languages in Europe. And it becomes the basis of much of modern linguistic science, right? So you've heard probably of Ferdinand de Saussure, right, who's the father of structural linguistics. You might not know that he was a Sanskrit professor, right? Leonard Bloomfield, who is a linguist who sets the direction for linguistic research in the 20th century in America, was a Sanskrit professor. Roman Jacobson, who had a big role to play. Noam Chomsky talks often about the Ashtadhyayi and Panini in his generative linguistics. So what happens in the mid-40s and in the early 50s is that programmers don't want to deal with zeros and ones, right? So before that, if you wanted to give instructions to a computer, you had to actually understand binary code, and that's what you did. You actually gave it, you've seen those IBM form cards, those punch cards that you fed. You actually had to understand binary code. So people were trying to figure out a way to make formal languages that a computer could understand, right? So a formal language, which is to say, a language where the syntax is completely controlled by a set of rules, right? So that if I say something to a computer, it goes and looks up the rule set and then tries to understand what I'm telling it. So where do they go? Well, they go looking in linguistics and modern linguistics. And where does modern linguistics come from? It's at the bottom of it somewhere is Panini's Ashtadhyayi. So in a strange way, the world that we live in now, which is dominated by computers and therefore the software languages that they speak, and we are being profoundly transformed by these languages, and well, goes back 2,500 years to an ancient Sanskrit grammar, which is, as you said, it's mind-blowing, it's wonderful. And so it was out of the excitement of things like this that I wanted to write the book, to show all these connections.
Yeah, because in fact, authors and programmers, computer programmers, seem to be obsessed with the same obsession with elegance and aesthetics and beauty, finally.
Right. So this might not be something that, again, people who are outside IT might know, that programmers think a lot about beauty, right? And you would ask the question, why, right? After all, you're just giving instructions to a dumb machine. Why would you care about the syntax? Why would you care about beauty? So the answer is that programmers don't really write for the machine. When you write code, you're actually writing for other programmers, right? Because somebody in the future, maybe 2 years from now and maybe 20 years from now, code lasts an awfully long time. All your financial transactions right now are being run by code that was written in the 60s and 70s, right? So what happens is that if I'm looking at 20-year-old code, I need to be able to see what it's doing and understand it. And so there's a great premium in the programming world placed on expressivity and clarity. And that, in a sense, when I read down a page of code, it should tell me a story about what it's trying to do. And then, in a larger way, the architecture of the code itself should also be self-explanatory. So in some sort of way, sort of like architects or musicians build beauty, programmers also think a lot about it and talk a lot about it and invent different languages, trying to get closer to that ideal of clarity and of expressiveness.
So no wonder that India, in fact, is the first software power today. It's
well, I think.
I mean, there's a connection.
There certainly is a connection. Although I would say it's also kind of happy historical accident, you know, in that.
Think so?
Yeah. Well, you know, I think after independence, everyone in the administration, all the politicians, and especially Jawaharlal Nehru, understood that the new state would be only sustained if there was a technological base. So they poured huge amounts of money into the Indian Institutes of Technology and similar institutions, right? Which at the time was controversial, and still people ask that question. If you have 500 million people on $2 a day, what are you doing building these, these rockets that you're sending up into space? But they understood that the survival of the state depended on this. And so from that time, there has been a constant production of a cadre of world-class engineers who, starting in the 60s, started to be snapped up by NASA, by Silicon Valley, by German industry. And then when the great 2000 date crisis happened, remember that? When you were told that because of fault in the way that dates were encoded in your computer, the world was going to end on December 31st, 2000. There were huge millions of lines of code that needed to be gone over. And India was ready with the manpower to tackle that task, right? So all of these things kind of fell together in a nice way to make possible, I think, the relative success of the Indian software industry, both inside and outside.
Yes, both inside and outside. Yeah. But at the end of the day, it translates, I mean, these codes that you're talking about and this research and this quest for beauty translates into the friendly aspect that we have in our hands.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, because this is what the stake is, after all. It's a commercial stake.
Right. And so what often happens is that as a programmer, you might want to write beautiful code, but your boss doesn't really care, right? And your boss says, just get the damn thing up and running, and we'll worry about elegance another day. So what that results in is a lot of really messy, ugly code. So your website for your bank might look really pretty, but under the surface might be this jungle.
Yes.
This absolute mess. And it gets to the point where you really cannot understand how a piece of code runs. Right? And I mean that quite literally. There are pieces of code running in the world today at institutions that nobody can fix and nobody can understand, because they've been worked on by 100 programmers over the last 20 years, and everybody's added on a little patch here. It's the Indian, in India we call this jugaad.
Jugaad, yeah.
So you don't have time, you don't have money, you need to fix something, you tape it up, and it works, and then you let it go. So, and it happens in incredible places, like the Pentagon, for instance, right? The Pentagon has a payroll system that it uses that is famously bad about paying soldiers and service people the right amount of money at the right amount of time, right? And when something goes wrong, you go up to them and they take a long time to fix it. Now, why is this happening? It's happening because their accounting software was written in the 1960s. It's about 6 million lines of COBOL code written in the 60s. They've lost all the documentation for the code a long time back, and now nobody understands how it works, and nobody can fix it, right? So it just rolls on. And in computer geek language, this is called big ball of mud. Right? It's just this big ball of mud that keeps rolling. We don't know how it works, but it works. Now, you might ask, why not just replace it? Well, it might cost you $500 million to build a system that is secure and that actually works to the way you want it to, but that also is not, because these systems are so large, you can't guarantee success, right? So for instance, President Obama's health fiasco, right, on the website. I mean, you have the best people working under stress on these systems, and sometimes they just fail. So often, the reason the Pentagon code keeps on running is because nobody has either the money or the what do you call it? Some boss has to make a decision and put his or her career on the line and say, let's replace this damn thing. But it's easier to just let it roll.
Right. I was saying that, in fact, Geek Sublime is a narrative nonfiction book that's going to, bring you across so many territories, and one of them is this intimate perception of Vikram's life, almost something quite autobiographical, in fact, and it gives me the feeling that we are witnessing your coming of age in India, and I just would like to talk about that because I would like to bounce back onto the Sanskrit issue. You write, I grew up in a Brahmin family, but without Sanskrit. During the 2nd millennium CE, many of the Sanskrit-speaking Hindu regimes that patronized scholarship and poetry were replaced by Muslim kingdoms that used Persian as a court language, which we're talking about, Mughal India that goes from the 12th century to, in fact, if you want to be correct, until 1857, right, until the 19th century. They did not necessarily mean neglect. Many of those new rulers continued to sponsor poets, schools, and translations. The immense prestige of the language and its role in the sanctification of kingship and power were attractive to the new establishments. And then you continue by saying, this ancient widespread transmission was finally fractured by the establishment of English as the language of colonial politics and commerce, and the institutionalization of new dispensations of morality, knowledge, and power. The upper castes, especially the Brahmins, devoted themselves energetically to adapting to the new networks of wealth and meaning, to converting their social capital into economic capital. Many in the colonial legislative systems thought that Indian knowledge was flawed materially and morally, and that the only cure for the ills of the culture was the enforcement of change through European education. The early awe with which the 18th century Orientalist scholars regard Indian thought and art gave way. And so my question about Sanskrit is, because I kind of feel a love and hate relationship that you have with or that you had when you were a kid, at least, with Sanskrit. Yeah. Do you think that there's a revival of Sanskrit, like there should be a revival of Greek and Latin here, or?
Well, so what happened to me as a kid, and I'm sure it happened to other Indians, is that when I was in 6th grade, Sanskrit was compulsorily introduced to me, and it was taught in the most painfully boring way that you can imagine. It was like terrible. And Mr. H.C. Pant, I still remember him well, enforced, Sanskritness with like sort of fierce discipline. And so what happens is, and also it was given this kind of sheen of moral authority, right? It was always supposed to be the most refined, the most godly, the most divine language. And so all the lessons themselves were full of good people doing good things, right? And when you give that to a 12-year-old, that results in hatred, right? in boredom. So I studied it for a couple of years, and then I ran away from it because I mean, I was interested in other things. And also, the way that it was taught to us made it seem that it had been always Brahmanical property, right? That only the upper caste used Sanskrit. So it was only when I was much older and was trying to figure out a way to think about the aesthetics of my books that I started to research Indian aesthetic theory, a lot of which is written in Sanskrit. So I discovered that there was another truth altogether, that Sanskrit, in fact, from sometime in the 1st millennium, in fact, had been used widely by Buddhists, by Jains, by Tantrics, who wrote things in Sanskrit that would make Vedic orthodox people, their hair curl. and that, you know.
But was it the same language? Was it the same?
Yeah, yeah. It was same. I mean, it was the language, the sort of the link language of the marga, of the path.
Yeah.
And so if you wanted to talk to other people in the subcontinent and exchange ideas, you did it in Sanskrit. And at the same time, you wrote perhaps in Telugu or Tamil or whatever else you spoke locally. So, and so much of our literature is exciting and fun and, you know, and devious and interesting and challenges orthodoxy, but none of that was actually given to us at that time. And so what it felt to me like was rediscovering this whole aspect of the culture that had been censored from me, that had been kept from me. And I guess that was one of the journeys that I describe in the book, is rediscovering all of this through my attempt to figure out what they thought about aesthetics in the old world.
You also talk about something that I brought to show you, but I left in my bag, which are the Amarchitarakata books, which sell by millions. I mean, Maggie, wouldn't you be happy to be the publisher of these books in India? Because I mean, these sales are just absolutely amazing. And I do like to talk about this a little bit to continue on to this, the Sanskrit. You write, our Sanskrit lessons were replete with high and serious enlightenment. The characters in our readers were pompous prigs of every age and gender who went on and on about right action and proper behavior. The vast irony was that every Indian child of my generation and after has voraciously consumed the brightly colored pages of the Amarchitarakata comic books, which recreate immortal picture stories from India's vast storehouse of narrative. In these comics, much is taken from Sanskrit literature, and in them, muscled epic heroes behave badly, lop off limbs and heads, tangle with monsters, and go on quests. Queens launch intricate intrigues. Beautiful women and men fall in love and have sex. Goddesses bless and create havoc. Great sages spy on voluptuous apsaras and inadvertently spill their seed and thereby cause dynastic upheavals and great wars. In short, the beloved Amarchitarakata comics contain all the gore and romance dear to a 12-year-old's heart, but we could read them only in Hindi or Tamil or English, never in Sanskrit. Would they have a future in Sanskrit?
Well, there's, I mean, there is an organization that is now trying to translate them, or at least they were as of the writing of the book. I don't know how far the attempt succeeded. And so I think as a means of, I learned English from reading Archie comics, right? And so I think the way that you interest a kid in language is to hand them interesting stories and let them discover the pleasure of story through a language. So it always seemed sort of a bad idea to me that we didn't have those in Sanskrit, right? Okay. Because that would have been one way of writing fairly simple, clear Sanskrit that would have made sense to anybody reading in India and would have allowed us to pick up the language without difficulty.
But do you think that the millions, the hundreds of millions copies that are sold every year are a help to actually keep the mythology alive?
Yes,
and
yeah.
the big myths. Is this the thing that, you know?
All right. No, I think that it does, and it was actually started with that intention by the person who founded the company was a computer engineer, and so he stated his intent was to watching his kids like me read in English, read all these other books, comic books. He wanted to give them something from the Indian tradition. And, you know, I have a sort of, as an adult, I have a kind of ambiguous relationship with the comics because they contain certain kinds of politics, certain kind of ideologies that are being reconstructed in a way that is very comfortable for certain political elements in India. And, you know, I think that discussion needs to be had also as much as the comics themselves are a means of reproducing culture. And, you know, stories transmit across media. So we've seen in the Mahabharata in many forms, right? In film
exactly.
and television.
Exactly.
And so I think necessarily they will take different shapes as we move through. And I'm sure, I mean, one of the interesting things about the last decade in Indian writing in English has been popular writing which is to say fantasy writing, which takes from Indian mythology and sort of does Game of Thrones in ancient India, you know, and it's wonderful.
Completely.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the reasons why Indian literature is so, I would say, so powerful today is because it's structured by mythology at the bottom and unconsciously. And I think it's you know, when you see the success of a book by Amish on Shiva, for instance, today, I mean, it's amazing, and the love of the Indians for their myths is also something which has, insofar as I'm concerned, much less to do with mystical preoccupations or with God than with a kind of a modelization, if I may say.
Yes.
Look what Ganesha does. Look what Shiva. Look at what Brahma does, and or even you know, look at what Yudhishthira and the Pandavas do. And let's apply this to life. Do you think that, in fact, life in India is as structured by mythology as literature is?
I think so. I think certainly it's part of our internal vocabularies, so that it forms the lens through which we see the world. And so we are both shaped by it, and we shape the world through it. And so I think it's very much there. As an artist, it's an incredible resource, because you have this, I guess, a storehouse of symbols and characters that you can reach backward to at any time, and then replace, not just sort of plonk them into your fiction, but use that to inform your own fiction. And I think, you know, in the political arena, we can clearly see people making use of those structures. Of those.
Well, I was going to say that sometimes they're so much recuperated, in fact, by the far right.
Yeah, and that's the part that I'm referring to, is that the actual past is much more various. It is full of people having very intelligent conversations with each other about deeply important stuff. And it's much more ambiguous than the simplified version that often gets shoved down our throats.
Mr. Ambassador of India is here today, so we have to be careful with what we're going to say.
I'm speaking only for myself. It's okay.
On the controversial side of Hinduism, if I may say, I'd like to ask you a question about Wendy Doniger's book. Wendy Doniger is a fabulous writer, passionately in love with India, as I am, and I completely understand why. But her latest book is about the Hindus, and there's some I would say some ill pressure from a group called the Shishka Bacha Wandolan Samiti, which means the Committee to Struggle to Save Education. Her publisher, who's also your publisher, pulped the book. Yeah. And pulped. I find this despicable, personally, from a publishing point of view. But this says. Does this say a lot, you think, about free speech today in the largest democracy in the world?
Absolutely, and I think it's a very dangerous trend. And so, again, to point out what might be wrong with that book is completely fair, right? And to speak back to it, I think, is necessary too. But this impulse to banish, to censor, right, to wipe out, to literally have pulped, is, I think, so ironically completely against everything the tradition has ever stood for.
In India.
In India. Yeah. Because our model for the production of knowledge is debate, right? There's always been vigorous debate. So in the old days, kings and rich people sponsored debates. Entire halls were built for the sole purpose of debate. Books were written about the rules of debate, right? How you presented logic, what constituted a good argument, what constituted a weak argument. And so this idea of samvad, mutual dialogue, right, was something that was central. And you can see this in the text. You can see the Buddhists talking to the Hindus, talking to the Jains, talking to the Muslims, against each other, but also learning from the dialogue. And the famous saying goes, from continuous dialogue emerges an understanding, right? So this idea that it's only when we speak to each other we find the truth, right? So I think the urge to sort of remove from the dialogue certain elements that you find uncomfortable is historically and ethically completely suspect, right? Because you're doing exactly, in order to, so you say you're trying to protect a tradition, but in order to protect that tradition, you're doing exactly what the tradition says you should not do.
Yeah.
It's completely bizarre. I hate to think that we are in a political atmosphere that would give rise to more of that, right? So that if Wendy's book or any other book is only the beginning and we're going to see more of this, then we have...
But do you think it's the beginning of a side path that India is taking today? Or?
Well, I think certainly certain elements would like it to be the beginning, right? That now that we've had the success, we've proved our method of enforcing change, therefore then we should take this experiment and then apply its methods in other arenas, right? And I think that would be a great loss, and it should not happen. It must not happen.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was trying to remember the Sanskrit. I'm talking a lot about Sanskrit, but I should tell you that I read Sanskrit at about a first grade level. I've been trying to learn it for the last couple of years on my own, and it's a hard language. I mean, there's no way.
Don't you regret not having pursued what you were supposed to do during your?
I know, Mr. Pant. I'm sorry. but the line, the actual Sanskrit line is Vade Vade Janyate Bodha, right? So Vade Vade, right? From talking and talking, generates or emerges understanding, or not knowing in a very active sense, bodha, knowledge itself. And I think we have to keep doing that. I think it would be a shame if we allowed that to not happen.
But the word for talking in Hindi is boltare, no? Bolta?
Yeah, well, buddhi comes from the same root.
Okay,
yeah, knowledge, yeah.
Knowledge, okay. Because I'm learning Hindi now. Struggling my way through Hindi. In Mirrored Mind, we spent some absolutely fascinating time with Abhinavagupta.
Yes.
Yeah. Abhinavagupta is this 10th, 11th century Shivaist Kashmiri poet whom I didn't know about until I read your book. Yeah. And I have to say that he's just amazing. I understand your fascination for him. Could you tell us more about him?
So the entry into this conversation about all these different topics that we've been touching on in the book was for me to take that question about the aesthetics of code and look at it more closely. And so hackers or programmers, because they deal with language, because they're looking for elegance, are now fond of saying things like hackers are artists, right? So somehow by writing elegant code, you're kind of becoming like Picasso, right? That's the general idea. So I was trying to investigate that, and then it occurred to me that if we are thinking about beauty in the context of a formal language, then we have the Sanskrit tradition, which is kind of a formal language, and which also has a very sophisticated tradition of thinking about beauty and aesthetics in the context of poetic language. So the earliest sort of ideas about what makes a poem beautiful were very formalist, right? So they thought, since they came from a linguistically based tradition, they thought that metaphor, simile, figures, alankara, ornamentation was what made language beautiful. And then some other people thought that it was a matter also of style, which they call riti, which is to say the way that a long compound word in Sanskrit can slow down the reader and therefore cause a different kind of sensation than short, choppy words, right? So that would be considered stylistic. So again, though, very formal, right? Dealing with the formal aspects of language. And until in the 9th century, along comes this guy called Anandvardhana, who writes a book called Dhvanyaloka. He writes the book called Dhvanyaloka, in which he proposes that poetry is beautiful not primarily because of figures, because of alankar. It is beautiful because it says without speaking. It speaks in silences. Now that's a very odd idea, and I should probably give you an example. So what he does is, in this book, in this text, is that he shows us certain poems And he argues that, okay, so let's listen to this. This is one of his examples. This is a woman speaking. "O holy monk, wander without fear. That little dog was killed today by him, that violent lion living in the thickets on the banks of the Godavari river." Right? So here we have a woman who's speaking to a monk who's come begging to her house, and she's saying, don't worry about that little dog who used to bother you in the village. That big lion killed him by the banks of the Godavari river. So Anandvardhana's commentary on this is, what is really going on in this poem? Is she really warning him about the little dog? No. She's trying to scare him away from the thickets down by the river where she meets her lover, right? So, but there's nothing in the denotative or the figurative language in this poem to suggest, to say that. It's all in the implication, right? Another example, here again, a woman is speaking.
Sounds like a Japanese haiku.
Exactly, yeah. Right. So another one, here again, a woman is speaking to a man, and look what she's saying. "Mother-in-law sleeps down here, and I there. Look while day remains, O traveler. Do not, blind in the night, lie down in my bed." Isn't that great? What is she doing? Is she really telling him that's where, don't fall into it? She's doing exactly the opposite. She's giving him an invitation.
Yeah. And
she's making sure he knows the way while there's still light to see. Right? So again, Anandvardhana's commentary is, this is what the beauty of poetry consists of, is the manifestation of feelings, of narrative, of figures, not by saying, but through this other power of language, which is vyanjana, suggestion, right?
But he didn't turn it into anything dogmatic.
Right.
Like, for instance, our French theorists, who obsessed the 70s and the 80s with something that actually killed the French novel, so far as I'm concerned.
Oh,
nothing like that, right?
Right. So what he's trying to do is to show you that poetry, art in general, works through suggestion, and the word that he uses for the successful suggestion in art is dhwani. Right? Literally means reverberation. So in other words, what poetry does is that it causes a reverberation within you, and an endless reverberation, right? Because there's no end to suggested meanings, right? You can always think of another context, another meaning, and so it's an endless reverberation. Like the sounding of a bell, that's one example he uses. And that is what we look for in great art, is that resonance that hides under the surface, right? So in the West, a great example of this kind of work would be Hemingway, right? Mm-hmm. With his whole idea of how the words are only the 1/3 that show above the surface of the water, 2/3 of the iceberg is underneath. What is not said is the beautiful thing. And you say by not speaking, right? And so then 100 years after him, comes Abhinavagupta, who's a great polymathic intellectual. So he's a metaphysician, he's a poet, he's also a very adept tantric. That's what his contemporaries tell us. And so he gets very interested in the psychology of aesthetic pleasure. And what he argues is, if you and I are watching some horrible, horrible scene on Game of Thrones, where some character that we've come to love for 2 years now is getting dismembered, why don't we run screaming from the room, right? And his argument is, well, because we know it's not real, right? So what happens is, through a kind of distancing from our own emotion, right? So I'm feeling pity and fear inside myself, but I'm not attaching myself to it. I'm not saying, Abhinavagupta puts it this way, that you do not say during aesthetic pleasure, this is happening to me, this is happening to a friend of mine, this is happening to an enemy of mine. So you can experience emotion without attaching your ego to it, right? And that's what makes it pleasurable, because you're able to contemplate yourself and, in a sense, become one with the emotion without attaching yourself to it. And so, of course, you can see where he's going with this in terms of his intellectual and spiritual thinking. What they argue is that that feeling, which they refer to as rasa, literally taste or juice, this heightened aesthetic pleasure, is exactly the same as the yogic experience, right? Because what do you do during meditation? What you do is you try and feel things. It's not that thoughts and ideas disappear from your head or pain disappears, but you try and not attach yourself to the pain. You let it come and you let it slip away. So the argument that Abhinavagupta makes is that in the experience of art, we experience the ultimate divine bliss, right, of union, right? Who is experiencing the emotion of fear within you? Well, you are. But who is looking at that fear? You are. So in art, the subject and object become one, right? And therefore divinity, right? You collapse everything into one. So, and this is just the barest, I'm touching the very tip of Abhinavagupta's incredibly large and sophisticated argument. So I found this really wonderful in terms of people thinking about literary theory as in a relation to pleasure, right? Which, as you point out, in the academy, both in India and outside India in the West, as I've experienced it over the last 20 years, 30 years, to talk about pleasure is to reveal yourself as a kind of naive, kind of some Yahoo, right? Who
There's
cares
something
about
beyond that. Always.
Yeah. We must deconstruct the text. We must think about the power relations within the text. But as a writer, what I spend my whole life doing is trying to think about how my language affects a presumed reader, right? Which in the Sanskritic universe, they would call the Sahriday. Right? So he's a connoisseur, Sa as in the same, Hriday as in heart. So your perfect viewer is somebody who has the same heart as you. So they are the receivers of your text, and they reflect it. They can enact it within themselves in the way that you want to.
I would like to end this session with these two beautiful, how would I say, perspectives. One is that Hemingway and one of the most beautiful age of Indian thought are connected. The second is that this theory of rasas, there are nine of them, because the Indians love to categorize. 4 emotions by women, 4 emotions felt by men. 64 positions in the Kama Sutra, 9 rasas. It's like beautiful categorizations like this. And what I want to say is that the rasas, in fact, are these emotions that art bring to us. And I would like to end this session by asking you to buy the book by Vikram and to get into it. And I can tell you that you will feel all of the rasas that Abhinavagupta is talking about. Thank you very, very much indeed.
Thank you.